Today we're diving into the Space Marine motor pool and talking about the strongest Space Marine battle tanks in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we're going a bit tread heavy and we're going to have a quick look through every single Space Marine heavy support tank both out of the standard codex and Forge World. There's an absolute ton to cover here, so we'll go quickly through the datasheets, talk roughly about what I think are the biggest pros and cons of each tank, a few relevant numbers including damage and durability, and a bit of a word on the competition from other units such as infantry and dreadnoughts. Loads to talk about here, so let's jump straight into it and talk about tanks in general. At the moment, Space Marine armour does seem to be having a bit of a hard time compared with some of the other options. The new codex wasn't incredibly kind to them, they're not quite as popular as dreadnoughts right now for the most part, they don't have the core keyword so won't get any rerolls from captains or lieutenants, and dreadnoughts also got army-wide duty eternal as well, making them a lot tougher for the points. Despite the 9th edition rules allowing vehicles to fire into combats when they are locked up, they're still kind of susceptible to being tagged in combat and being shot down from what they'd actually want to shoot at. Even if they do have the option to fire at the enemy unit in combat with them, it often still makes more sense to drop back anyway. That one tank's firepower might not be enough to wipe out the enemy unit, and it's much better to focus your whole army on them. In addition, if you don't kill the unit, you're basically gifting your opponent free hits on your tank in your own combat phase, which is rarely a good thing. Obviously that's on a case-by-case basis, but just personally, I've rarely found myself making use of shooting in close combat with vehicles. If the enemy starts swarming all over your battle line, you're still going to have problems with an armoured division. In terms of buffs that you can use on them, the Tech Marine is perhaps one of the best choices. He can give you +1 to hit and also repair the vehicles, so if you are going quite tread heavy then that's a good idea. And also some chapters are better suited to mechanised warfare than others, notably such as the Iron Hands with their Feel No Pain, slower degrading, and a whole bunch of different boosts for them, including their psychic powers. With all that said, let's get on to actually looking through the tanks then. First up, we'll start with the Gladiator tank series. Fairly expensive both in points and money, these Space Marine battle tanks are toughness 8, 12 wounds, and you can get 3 variants in the Reaper, Lancer and Valiant. This one's the Reaper for 230 points, it packs a twin heavy onslaught Gatling cannon with 24 shots at strength 6 AP-1, so it's pretty much guaranteed to chew through hordes. It also supports 2 Tempest bolters, both rapid fire 4 weapons with strength 4 and AP-1 and a decent 30-inch range. This one's basically the tank to go to if you're chewing through enemy hordes. In addition, all of these Gladiator tanks can take an Icarus rocket pod and Iron Hell heavy stubber, both of which are really decent firepower upgrades for the 5-point cost. This one's the Valiant, the close-range anti-tank variant. It sports a turret-mounted twin las talon, that's 4 shots that are essentially las cannons with 24-inch range, and 2 multi-melters on the sponsons, giving this guy a very respectable 8 heavy anti-tank shots when it's within 24 inches. Per tank they are fairly hard to shift with that toughness 8 profile, but I would bear in mind that they cost quite a lot of points, so their durability per point isn't actually all that great. The third variant, the Lancer, just really doesn't compete on any level. That's the long-range one with the laser destroyer that hits on 2s, but it only averages around 2.3 wounds on a toughness 7 vehicle per 100 points. If you compare that to the Valiant, which I know is a lot more close range and a bit more expensive, but that one will give you 4.5 wounds per 100 points on a toughness 7 vehicle. So point for point the Valiant does just about twice as much damage as the Lancer. It completely blows it out of the water in my opinion. Throughout this video I'll do quite a few comparisons per 100 points. Just arbitrarily our tanks are going to be shooting at either toughness 7 vehicles or Orc Boys, just to highlight some rough damage against either vehicles or hordes. The Reaper, as you'd expect, does pack a really good punch against hordes, 5.8 dead Orc Boys per 100 points, and it would be even more than that if you can get those Tempest bolters in rapid fire range. Perhaps one of the main weaknesses though is that you have to fire all 24 shots all into one unit, which can be a little bit problematic sometimes. Sometimes you might get some quite decent overkill with that and waste some damage. Overall, out of the Gladiator tanks, my favourites are by far the Valiant and the Reaper. Moving on to their more old school competitors, we have the Predator Annihilator and Predator Destructor. They're only toughness 7 with 11 wounds, but they do cost significantly less than the Gladiator tanks, have the options to take Storm Bolters and a Hunter Killer missile, and like most of the standard pattern Space Marine vehicles, they all have the smokescreen keyword, which can make them a little bit harder to kill in a pinch. You can use that 1 command point stratagem to make them -1 to hit if you are pretty certain that the opponent is going to try and focus your tank down. The main advantages of the standard pattern Predators are that they have really quite good range, and point for point they are more durable than their Gladiator equivalents. The Gladiators gaining 1 pip of toughness and 1 extra wound just really doesn't make up for their far increased price tag in terms of durability. In terms of damage, the Predator Annihilator is decently behind the Gladiator Valiant. It'll only do you 3 wounds per 100 points rather than 4.5, but it does enjoy far longer range for that. The Destructor is far worse against vehicles, but with an average of 4 shots on its damage 3 autocannon, it's a decent specialist at taking out anything that's either 3 wounds or a light vehicle with toughness 6 or 5. I think the two are fairly well balanced. I perhaps prefer the Annihilator just a little bit because it's 130 points rather than 140 base. For the Sons of Sanguinius, they of course have their own unique Bar Predator. That one's 120 points with the Flamestorm Cannon, or 130 with the Assault Cannon. With the Assault Cannon, it averages 4.1 dead Orc Boys per 100 points, so quite decently behind the Gladiator Valiant's 5.8, but of course the Bar Predator is almost half the cost, so point for point it's far more durable. I must admit I'm not a desperate fan of the Flamestorm Cannon. It's heavy d6, strength 6, AP-2 and damage 2, and for me it's just fairly underwhelming. You're only really going to do chip damage to enemy units with that, and you have to get at least fairly close, easily within range of reprisals from enemy shooting or combat. In general, I'd say the Predators aren't desperately strong at the moment, but they do have pros and cons over the Gladiators. Essentially, if you want more durability, then the Predator tanks are the way to go. If you want more damage output, then pick up the Gladiator tanks. Out of the two, I'd probably lean towards the Gladiators. In 9th edition, they're going to be competing against other very nasty gun platforms, and I think you just really can't afford to have your opponent basically just ignore your backline firepower, as they might be able to do with the Predators. Sure, they might chip away at your army each turn, but it could allow your opponent to go after the rest of the army and just soak up the damage from the Predator tanks, which isn't quite as potent. Next up, we move on to the trusty Vindicator. This one's 130 points, or 140 if you give it a siege shield, and for that you get an 11 wound toughness 8 tank with the d6 shot demolisher cannon at 24 inches, strength 10, AP-3, damage d6 and blast. I do quite like the new rules for the siege shield on the Vindicator. They can make it a very tough little tank indeed. That 10-point investment essentially gives you a 2+ save against ranged attacks, and with toughness 8 as well on a fairly cheap platform, it's really quite hard to shift. You need to have either 5 las cannons or 8 missile launchers for 100 points to take it down, which is far better than the Predators and the Gladiators. Its damage output against vehicles is also reasonably respectable. Against tanks, it averages 3.2 wounds per 100 points on a toughness 7 vehicle, so a bit better than the Predator Annihilator, and really not bad on such a tough platform. However, it is very swingy. You might roll a 1 for the number of shots, and it can often be a case of getting very much all or nothing out of it. For what it's worth, it does have Blast, which can be helpful against hordes a bit, but it is a bit vulnerable to being locked up, as it won't even be able to shoot in melee. Overall, I do quite like the Vindicator. It's got enough threat that it can't really be ignored, and also it is very hard to chew through, with that nice toughness 8 and a 2+ save. Moving on, we come to the anti-air of the Space Marines, and the Hunter and Stalker. The Hunter, the one with the big missile, will cost you 110 points, and again it's incredibly durable per point at toughness 8 with 11 wounds for such a low price tag. The Hunter's armed with a Sky Spear missile. It's essentially a 60-inch ranged lad cannon, only 1 shot unfortunately, but of course it's extra nasty against aircraft. If you shoot against an aircraft with it, you add 2 to your hit roll, and you also change the damage characteristic to d6+6. That is pretty insane, an average of 9.5 wounds on an enemy flyer if you do get the shot through. The Stalker on the other hand packs those twin Icarus storm cannons, a total of 6 shots at strength 7, AP-1 and damage 2, and when you take aim at an aircraft unit, you get a mighty 12 shots instead of 6, and you also add 1 to the hit rolls. Basically both of these do over double damage if you fire at aircraft compared with ground units. Overall, Hunters and Stalkers have great durability for the points cost. They're always going to be a pain to chew through, but at the price of not really doing all that much damage. The Hunter is really quite underwhelming unless you fire at aircraft. Against standard vehicles, you're only averaging 1.2 wounds per 100 points, which is frankly quite bad, though it does go up to an average of 4 wounds per 100 points against toughness 6 aircraft, though it is very swingy as to whether you get the shot go through or not. You're basically either getting no damage or between 7 and 12. The Stalker for 115 points is quite a lot more generalist. Those essentially autocannon shots will do you around about 1.7 wounds per toughness 7 vehicle, and with 6 shots they're quite decent at chewing through some light infantry as well. Still not exactly stellar damage output, but in some matchups, say against Drakari with a bunch of low toughness vehicles with poor saves, they'll be absolutely great. Again, it's far better if you're targeting a toughness 6 aircraft. You're averaging 4.6 wounds per 100 points from this guy, so it doesn't have the all or nothing effect, but it does pretty much beat out the Hunter. Out of the two, I think the Stalker is by far the better choice. Better damage against all ground targets and infantry, and better damage against most aircraft as well, while also being more reliable. Really though, these two are only ever going to be good if you are knowing that you're fighting aircraft, and aircraft aren't particularly popular in the 9th edition meta right now. If we do see lots of planes dominating the skies again though, then perhaps the Stalker might make a bit more of an appearance. Moving on, we come to the Whirlwind, the Space Marine artillery tank. They cost you 125 points at the moment, and you can either choose a Castellan or a Vengeance launcher. The Castellan launcher is dedicated anti-infantry, 2d6 shots at strength 6 AP 0, and the Vengeance is 2d3 shots at strength 7 AP -1 and damage 2, so a bit better at engaging heavy infantry or light vehicles. They're quite cheap, so I'd say they have roughly medium durability, not outstanding but certainly not bad either, but their damage output is rather poor. They basically pay really quite a big tax for being able to shoot with ignores line of sight firepower, which certainly has its advantages, being able to surprise units with damage that are lurking on objectives or thought they were safe out of line of sight. It really isn't all that much damage though, you're averaging around about 1.2 wounds per 100 points on a toughness 7 vehicle. That's with the Vengeance launcher, or around 2 to 4 dead orcs per 100 points with the Castellan launcher, depending on whether or not they're over 10 models in a unit. I think you probably could make a case for either of the sets of missiles. Naturally, Castellans will be better against hordes, and Vengeance will be slightly better against anything slightly tougher, at the expense of 10 extra points. Perhaps one of the best reasons to run Whirlwinds at the moment is the suppression fire stratagem, which if they target an enemy unit, you can spend 1 command point so that unit won't be able to fire Overwatch in the coming charge phase. Can be really quite powerful against certain armies that have insane overwatch, say a unit of Salamander's aggressors for example. I certainly wouldn't want to be running too many Whirlwinds in a list, most likely 1 or 2 at most, just to give a little bit of ignores line of sight shooting and access to that stratagem. You really can't afford to go too heavy on them because their damage output is pretty bad. Next up we have the Land Raiders. All of these now cost 285 points, and they're fairly solid constructions with toughness 8 and a 2+ save and 16 wounds. They all have a reasonable transport capacity, the standard one having 10, and the Crusader and Redeemer having more, and they can also transport Terminators and Centurions should you wish to. All the Land Raiders also have Power of the Machine Spirit, so if you do want to pay the very expensive command point stratagem for 2 CP, they can fight on top bracket if they need to. In general, the Land Raiders have fair enough durability per point, with 3.6 las cannon hits or 6.4 missile launcher hits to take 100 points of the unit down. Better than most, but not quite as good as the Vindicator for example. As a very impressive points intensive unit that often wants to be getting close, they are very vulnerable to being tagged in melee still, though at least they will be able to unload their guns into whatever did tag them these days. For me, I'm just not incredibly sold about the transport capacity of the Land Raider. With the way that movement works in 9th edition, it just often doesn't make all that much sense. The Land Raider's only going to be moving 10 inches, presuming you want to fire all those guns that you paid for, and a lot of squads on foot will be highly likely to get that far just by advancing. If its durability was absolutely through the roof, then it might be worth considering a bit more, but I just don't think it's quite there. In general, I just prefer to take more of the unit that I was transporting than investing in Land Raiders to transport them. If you were slogging Terminators into battle, for example, you could basically get an entire extra Terminator squad for the cost of your transport. You do of course have 3 different variants of the Land Raider, the standard one, the Crusader and the Redeemer. They all have their merits, though I might be more tempted by the standard one myself. At least that one gives you some really big and pricey anti-tank fire that you can't get elsewhere in the Space Marine Codex quite as easily. Other chapters certainly have synergy with the others though, like Imperial Fist with all those bolters on the Crusader, or maybe Black Templars making use of them because of fluff, and Salamanders getting +1 to wound with those Redeemer Flamestorm cannons. Overall though, I'm afraid Land Raiders do just remain a bit underwhelming at the moment. Moving on, we come to the Primaris Land Raider equivalents, the Repulsor and the Repulsor Executioner. These are even more expensive than the Land Raider, the standard Repulsor clocking in at 315 points. It has toughness 8, 16 wounds, but only a 3+ armor save, so it isn't quite as durable to return fire. Repulsors are positively covered in guns sticking out at every angle though. Just base, you get a heavy onslaught Gatling cannon, multiple heavy stubbers, grenade launchers, storm bolters, heavy bolters, a Hunter Slayer missile, and auto launchers, which you can swap out for even more grenade launchers. The standard Repulsor transports 10 models, but if you want a more firepower orientated platform, you can trade out to the Repulsor Executioner, which only has 6 model transport capacity, but of course gains an extra really big gun on the top that hits on 2s. The Heavy Laser Destroyer is Heavy 2, Strength 12, AP-4, and a big damage of D3+3, and the Macro Plasma Incinerator on Supercharged mode is Strength 9, AP-4, and flat damage 3, with a big heavy D6 shots. I would say that the latest Space Marine Codex really hasn't been kind to Repulsors and Executioners. Their point-for-point durability just really isn't all that good at all. Per 100 points, you're only needing 2.3 las cannons or 3.8 missile launchers to take them down, and it's just quite impressively inferior to a lot of the other Space Marine tanks. Really, they do need to justify themselves with their own firepower, and again, their transport capacity doesn't have the most point. You can hide Primaris units inside, and it's certainly not the worst move if you do have one of these on the table, but I'd certainly not include one myself with the sole aim of being a transport. Shooting wise, the standard Repulsor can make itself quite a decent anti-infantry platform if it wants to, with all of those many guns sticking out of it. If you can get within 18-inch range, you can average about 6 dead orcs per 100 points invested, so pretty similar to the Gladiator Reaper. Of course, that thing functions far better at longer range and has better durability per point though. Out of the 2 weapons on the Repulsor Executioner, I'd say the Macro Plasma Incinerator is my favourite. It's flat better against everything if it's overcharging, and it's also a bit cheaper as well, though of course you do run the risk of taking a mortal wound or 2. Overall though, its performance still isn't exactly stellar. It'll average about 3 dead orcs per 100 points, and about 1.5 wounds on a vehicle for every 100 points invested. It's not a terrible mix of firepower, but with this low durability point for point, it just doesn't compete very well with its rivals. At the moment, it's just not really the best time for these floating Primaris fortresses of death. If we take a look at some of the heavy support choices from Forge World, there are a few interesting picks. First we have the Vindicator Laser Destroyer. This one's 175 points, and it can't take a siege shield, but it does get a very powerful gun. This Laser Destroyer is Heavy 3, Strength 10, AP-4, and flat damage 6, though you can take a mortal wound or 2 on it if you do move at the same time. In terms of stacking damage on enemy vehicles, this one actually has really quite impressive numbers. You average 4.5 wounds on a toughness 7 vehicle per 100 points invested, so about the same as the Gladiator Valiant, though again, whether you get the shots through on this is really big all or nothing. You could potentially do 12 wounds in one shooting phase, but you could very easily do 0. Compared with the standard Vindicator, its damage output is better, but its durability is quite a bit worse. We also have the Sakaran series of tanks from Forge World. They're between 170 and 200 points, and they have a pretty solid base stat line with 14 wounds, a 2+ armor save, and a very nice fast movement of 14 inches. All very good things in my opinion. There's 4 variants of the Sakaran turret. You can take the Venator. That one's got a neutron laser that's heavy 3, strength 12, AP-3, and if it stays still it gets flat 6 damage. Not quite as good point for point in terms of damage as the Laser Destroyer Vindicator, and it is a bit hampered in terms of not being able to move when it does that, but against certain things it'll be more durable, and it is a lot faster when it does want to move. The Omega packs a really big plasma gun. That's 36 inches, heavy 6, strength 9, AP-3, and flat damage 3. As with most plasma, it does run the risk of taking wounds from overcharging, but it competes very well in anti-tank roles and can also do a much better job of harassing infantry, a pretty decent tool for taking down things like Primaris Marines in Gravis armor. The battle tank is a little bit cheaper at 180 points. That one's got a heavy 6 autocannon at strength 7, AP-2, and flat damage 3. I'm afraid I'd just personally take the Omega over that. I'm not sure the savings is worth it compared with losing AP and strength. We've got the Sakaran Punisher, which is 170 points for 18 shots at strength 6, AP-1, and damage 1. That one will average you around 5.5 orc boys per 100 points, so it does compete fairly well with things like the Gladiator Reaper. And seeing as it has a 2+ armor save and very fast movement, it is a fairly respectable choice. Finally, last of the Sakaran series, we have the Arcus, which I'm afraid I left off this list. This one's another artillery tank. Its multi-launcher does 2d6 shots at strength 6, AP-1, and damage 2, and like the Whirlwind, it can target units that aren't visible to it. It's 170 points, so a decent whack more, but again it's fairly respectably tough, fast, and in general it will do a bit more damage per point than either of the Whirlwind variants. Overall, I think that the Sakaran series is quite an interesting alternative. They seem fairly comparable to the core Codex tanks in general. My favourites are perhaps the Omega and the Punisher. though I would bear in mind that you do have to pay a command point when you take them because of their martial legacy rule. For that reason I'd be tempted not to absolutely spam them, but it's a bit less painful if you were just including maybe one of them in the army. Finally, for the Forge World heavy support choices, we come to the Relic Whirlwind Scorpius. This one's 170 points and gets you 3d3, strength 6, AP-2, damage 2 shots that of course ignores line of sight. Just in terms of damage output, it will do better than the standard Whirlwind against the vast majority of targets, but it does have the downside of not being able to use that suppression fire stratagem. In particular, it does have a bit of a niche for killing things like Primaris Marines that are out of line of sight. It'll wound them on 3s and have a fairly decent AP to chew through their armour. Should fairly reliably kill 1 or 2 per turn. So overall, out of Space Marine heavy support tank choices, here's a very rough list of the ones that I think are some of the stronger and weaker choices. The Vindicator and Laser Destroyer both have fairly decent numbers and fairly good durability for killing tanks. The Gladiator Reapers and Valiant both have really quite good damage per point against hordes and vehicles respectively. The Sicaran Omega is really quite flexible, being able to engage tanks and infantry, and the Punisher puts out quite a bit of anti-infantry fire. Finally, I would argue that the Whirlwind and Whirlwind Scorpius are among the top choices for Space Marine tanks. Neither of their damage outputs is really all that impressive to be honest, but having a little bit of ignores line of sight firepower can be a really decent asset to an army. I just wouldn't personally take them in abundance. Moving a bit further down to tanks that I think are okay but not particularly stand out, we have the Stalker, Predator tanks, Repulsor and Repulsor Executioner, and the other Sicaran variants. Finally, the ones that I'm really not a big fan of at the moment are Land Raiders, the Hunter, and the Gladiator Lancer. The Land Raider's transportability just isn't great right now, and the Hunter and Lancer just really don't do enough damage to justify the investment. Finally, I would just like to mention the obvious competition to Space Marine tanks, and why in general they're not seeing play quite as much as normal. In terms of stacking damage on vehicles, of course we have things like Eradicators to contend with. The best of the tanks seem to manage around about 4.5 to 5 wounds per 100 points, where Eradicators do a casual 6.9, even with their increased points cost. Stack that on top of some excellent stratagems such as Transhuman Physiology, rerolls from the core keyword, better melee, and all the advantages of being infantry. It's not surprising that we see a lot more of these than we do tanks. For Space Marine armour, Redemptor Dreadnoughts seem to be pretty much the go-to right now. They're very generalist when you give them a Plasma Incinerator, Icarus Pod and Onslaught Gatling Cannon, stacking around 3 wounds on a vehicle and 3 dead orcs each turn. They've got the core keyword and rerolls from that, plus melee threat, and they're durable on top of that. With Duty Eternal they get very close in durability to things like Vindicators when they're fired at with las cannons. Finally, for my ranged Dreadnought comparison, the Grav Bombard Leviathan did win out pretty well in terms of raw stats, even if you can't get rerolls for it. Against vehicles it'll do an average of 5 wounds per 100 points, and with big multi-damage high AP shots it's pretty great against heavy infantry as well. Again, stacking up against the tanks, it is really quite durable, 5 las cannons to kill every 100 points of it, or 9 missile launchers, basically being exactly the same as the Vindicator. Certainly very tough competition for the Space Marine motor pool, and it's not hard to see why the tank armies aren't appearing quite as much on the table as they were previously. So I look forward to hearing all of your tank related insights down in the comments below. I'll be really interested to hear which vehicles you're using in your Space Marine army right now, and what kind of roles they're filling. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the 40k content coming, with new videos out pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying watching regularly, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.